The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's broadcast. This webinar is being brought to you by the State-Federal RPS Collaborative. This project is managed by CISA. And today's topic is altering the load shape to accommodate more solar and wind. And to begin with, I'd like to go over a quick housekeeping slide. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode throughout the whole broadcast, so we will not be able to hear you. You can connect to the audio portion of the webinar using your computer speakers or a headset, or you can listen in via telephone. We suggest that you listen in via your computer and avoid telephone charges, but if you are listening in with us today by phone, we ask that you please enter the audio pin into your telephone keypad. Today we're also encouraging all of our webinar participants to please type your questions into the question box that you'll see on your console. You can do this at any time during today's broadcast, and we will queue up your questions and they will be answered during a Q&A session at the end of our presentation today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to you on CISA's website. You can see the webinar address on our screen. And with that, I would like to introduce Warren Leon. Warren is the project director for the State-Federal RPS Collaborative, and he's going to introduce today's guest speaker and talk a little bit about the RPS Collaborative. Warren, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Samantha. First, I want to tell you, if you're not familiar with CISA, what we are. We're a national nonprofit organization that works to implement smart clean energy policies and programs. And at the core of our organization is a national network of public agencies, more than 20 agencies spread out through about 15 states across the country, agencies that are individually and collectively working to advance clean energy. And if, Samantha, you can go to the next slide. And one of the things we do at the Clean Energy States Alliance is to manage the State-Federal RPS Collaborative. And this is a program that's funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. And what the State-Federal RPS Collaborative does is it promotes interchange and dialogue among state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and other stakeholders. We have a monthly newsletter with updates and events from around the wonderful world of RPS across the country. So if you want to keep current on what's going on with state RPSs, find out about other webinars we have and other events like our annual State Federal RPS Summit, which takes place in Washington, D.C. in the fall. You can sign up for the collaborative mailing list through the email below. And if you don't want to remember that long address, just go to cisa.org and click on the State Federal RPS Collaborative when you get there. If you could go to the next slide. Today we have a very interesting and important presentation that I know many state policymakers and others have been interested in because it addresses a big concern. As more intermittent power from solar and wind comes onto the system, how can we avoid having real problems with the daily and seasonal load shape so that we can continue to implement intermittent renewable energy in an appropriate and cost-effective manner? And Jim Lazar of the Regulatory Assistance Project several months ago produced a very ingenious and important report that he's going to talk to us about today that addresses this issue of the load shape. Jim Lazar is a senior advisor to the Regulatory Assistance Project, and he's based out in Olympia, Washington. He, in addition to his work for the Regulatory Assistance Project, he has maintained a consulting practice in electric and national gas utility rate making and resource planning since 1982. He's had a wider range of clients ranging from municipal electric utilities, other utilities, regulatory commissions, and public interest organizations around the world. And he's been a principal author of handbooks and articles on consumer protection and consumer participation in electric utility planning, integrated resource planning, and incentive regulation. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Jim, but let me say one thing. Please type in your questions at any point. I'll be collecting them when Jim gets done with his presentation. Then I'll ask the questions of him that have come in. So with that, let me turn things over to Jim.
Thanks, and good morning. Just an audio check. Warren, is everybody hearing me?
They sure are.
Okay. Warren did a fine introduction. This presentation is on a publication we did called Teaching the Duck to Fly. And if you're not familiar with the duck, you will be very, very soon. This is the California ISO duck curve. And what it's showing is the current load in 2012 is relatively smooth through the day. And it's fairly easy for the utility to follow with a mix of nuclear, gas, hydro, wind, solar, and other resources. But what's expected as more and more solar comes on the system, the midday load will decline because more and more of that load will be served with solar. And the residual line here is the line of load to be served with non-solar and wind resources, that is dispatchable resources. And the real challenge is this very steep neck of the duck, with the ramp up in California expected to be as much as 13,000 megawatts in 3 hours. And frankly, the system wasn't really designed for that. That increased solar in particular means very, very steep afternoon ramping. Now this is a California duck, but ducks are migratory species, and they may be visiting where you live soon. Now what causes this challenge is really no surprise. There's variable loads. We've had those forever. Utilities have evolved over 125 years to follow the load of people waking up in the morning and turning stuff on, and after the 50s and air conditioning became common, meeting air conditioning loads in the afternoons. Wind power is a variable source of supply. Sometimes it's producing thousands and thousands of megawatts in California, and sometimes it's not. But the real change is the growth of solar, which is predictably not available to meet the afternoon peak demand. And it's that predictability that's creating the challenge of the duck. But you know, ducks can fly. The California ISO duck, it looks like a duck in water. It's got a fat belly, so it floats. It's got a steep neck, so it can breathe and watch out for predators. And you know, that's one kind of duck. But a duck in flight has a whole different shape. The duck in flight stretches out its body, straightens out its neck in order to reduce wind resistance. And that's the duck that it would be much easier for utilities to follow. So our job is to straighten this duck out so it can fly right. The paper addresses 10 strategies to align loads to resources, and I'll touch on each of these, but focus on a couple of them in the presentation today. The 10 are targeted energy efficiency, orienting solar panels to the west, using some solar thermal energy as in addition to photovoltaic, so you can have storage, managing electric water heat, requiring storage on new large air conditioners, retiring older inflexible generating plants, concentrating the rates into the ramping hours, deploying electricity storage, implementing aggressive demand response programs, and using interregional power exchanges. Now, not every strategy will be applicable to every utility, and there are other strategies that are available in various parts of the country and parts of the world that will work. So our starting point is we have to start from somewhere. So I picked a particular California utilities projected duct. It doesn't really matter which one it is. This utility has about a 4,000 megawatt peak demand and a 2,000 megawatt minimum demand at 3 in the morning or midnight. The maximum ramp in the afternoon is about 400 megawatts. The average daily load factor across this blue line here, about 73%. But the forecast by 2020, with the addition of 2,500 megawatts of wind and solar added, is to have only a 63% load factor and a sharper ramp rate here of 550 megawatts per hour. So that's our starting point for our duct, and our job is going to be to straighten this duct out. So the first strategy is targeted energy efficiency. That is focusing on energy efficiency measures that have an afternoon peak orientation. Kitchen lighting is a great example. People come home from school, come home from work, and where do they spend their time? They spend their time in the kitchen. So that's one that's oriented to that time of the day. Central air conditioning is obviously a huge opportunity for addressing the afternoon peak load. So I put in some a little bit of energy efficiency, a 5% overall energy efficiency reduction, but with a peak orientation getting 3 times as much savings in the peak hours as during the middle of the night by focusing on measures that are. So we've now shifted the duct. Everything has gone down, and things have changed shape a little bit. Now, the next strategy is to orient solar panels to the west. Most solar panels installed on rooftops are fixed axis panels. So they're racked in one direction or another, most often south. But if we were able to orient 1 out of 6 systems to the west, we would shift the production of those to start later in the morning and go longer in the afternoon. This line here shows what happens at 6 o'clock, oriented to the south in blue. It's almost gone by 6 p.m., oriented to the west. There's still quite a bit of production left at 6 p.m. So now we're going to shift our duct a little bit more. We're losing a little bit of solar production in the morning. We're adding a little bit of solar production later in the day. It's helping us a little bit. The third is to use solar thermal in place of some solar photovoltaic. Solar thermal energy is more expensive, but it can be stored for a few hours. Solar thermal means the sun shines on reflectors which boil a fluid, here in red. The fluid can either go directly into a generator or it can go into a storage tank and can be stored as a heated fluid and then used later to generate. So I've put in 7% of the total solar added to this particular system is solar thermal, and that's pretty typical of what's happening now in the desert Southwest. Is sort of a small percentage of the solar that's being installed is solar thermal. This also takes some generation out of the early part of the day and puts it into the later part of the day, so that the net load to be served with the dispatchable resources is smoothed out a little bit. The fourth strategy, and what's probably the most important of all of these, is to control electric water heating. That is, to install grid control of electric water heating, and in many cases it makes sense to supercharge that hot water up into the 140 to 170 degree range during the low-cost hours. The diagram you see is the control panel of one of the manufacturers of grid integrated water heating, Steffes Corporation, that allows the grid operator to see that this water heater has a total of 25 kilowatt hours of storage capacity. It is charged to, in this case, 147 degrees, 145 degrees. So that's using 16 kilowatt hours of the storage. There's still another 9 kilowatt hours of storage left in this water heater. Now, you're storing that water heat to use it later. People want to have hot water in the morning and hot water in the evening, but they really don't care when the water is heated. And with super insulated tank and grid controls, you can do all of that water heating during the low-cost hours. And this, again, takes a little bit of load out of the early part of the day, puts it into the later part of the day, can take some out of the middle of the day and put it into the neck of the duck and help us straighten this duck's neck out. The complementary strategy is thermal storage on air conditioning. Nearly every one of us has an ice storage system in our home. My ice maker sits there and chunks along, making 12 ice cubes an hour all day and all night. And I can use 288 ice cubes a day whenever I need them. Ice storage for air conditioning isn't really a lot more sophisticated than that. This strategy is to require new large air conditioners to include thermal storage. And this would enable us to move about 15% of the peak commercial air conditioning load outside of peak hours with it's a implementation that would be possible between now and 2020. This could be, over time, a much, much larger resource. Chilled water or ice storage could move the entire cooling load. And this is an example from CalMac, which is, I think, the largest vendor of air conditioning storage, put together to take the entire cooling load in a commercial office building and do that during off-peak hours. Now, that's sort of living in the thermal power plant era. In the solar and wind era, you would want to have more control of this. You might want to do some of the charging in the middle of the day when the sun is shining. You might want to ramp it on and off as the wind picks up or dies off. But with grid operator controls, we can store the cooling when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing or the load is low, and use it in the middle of the day when we need to cool our buildings. Now, I can't understress how important the air conditioning part of this is. This is a graphic from Texas that shows the total state load on a 64-degree day in Dallas compared to a 109-degree day. Residential load quadruples. The commercial load doubles. The industrial load stays about the same, goes up a little bit. The driver of this is air conditioning. That's where this peak is coming from. There's 3 different ways to get air conditioning storage implemented in a widespread manner. The first would be appliance standards. If the U.S. DOE or state appliance standards required new large air conditioners to have thermal storage, over time, as appliances were installed in new buildings or replaced in existing buildings, we would get them. The second is with service standards. Most utilities have service standards that say they will not serve certain types of loads or will only serve them if there is grid operator control of those, or require special pricing or special contracts for certain loads. Utilities could, with the permission of the regulators, could adopt service standards that say we will not serve air conditioners over 5 tons unless they have grid operator control and storage. And the third is the traditional retrofit incentives approach of utilities or third-party administrators providing financial assistance to help people pay the cost of retrofitting ice storage. The third is well underway in some areas. There are a number of utilities in California that have programs with Ice Bear. There's very rapid rollout now happening of ice storage in high-rise buildings in New York City in response to Con Ed's demand response program. So there's plenty of opportunities out there. Some of them are being exploited. I put a pretty small amount of this in. In retrospect, if I were doing the paper over, I would make this a much larger resource. We've taken a little bit of energy in the morning, and we're using it in the neck of the duck. It's important to look at the cost of energy storage. This is a graphic that was put together by Sandia looking at electricity storage mechanisms. The blue are pumped storage, hydro and compressed air storage. The orange ones are the kinds of batteries, and the grays are some other flywheels and capacitors. The vertical axis here is the capital cost per unit of energy storage per kilowatt hour, and these are sort of in the $100 to $1,000 a kilowatt hour for the amount of energy stored. And the horizontal axis is the capital cost per unit of power per kilowatt that can be delivered instantaneously. And these are kind of centered around $1,000 a kilowatt of installed capacity. If I add water heaters to this, it is at the low end of both the energy and capacity range. A water heater sells for $500, and it can hold 15 to 25 kilowatt hours. It is dramatically cheaper than any other form of energy storage. Chilled water and ice thermal storage also fall at the low end of both the capital cost per kilowatt hour and capital cost per kilowatt of capacity. So I've spent a lot of time on thermal storage, and the reason is I think it's the least understood opportunity that's out here. This is a graphic I put together that shows the thermodynamic efficiency of different kinds of storage. With a storage water heater, you have about 95% efficiency in storing the energy. That is, you have about 5% standby losses when you're heating water before you really need to. But because you're heating it at low demand times on the grid, you're experiencing lower line losses when you're charging it than if you were allowing it to run on an as-used basis. We get up in the morning, we use hot water, and so you basically get that 5% in standby losses back in loss reduction. You get that loss reduction benefit from any storage technique that is sort of at the load or at the customer's premises, or at least at the substation. Air conditioning has a different benefit. While making ice at night and using it during the day is only about 75% efficient, you gain the benefit of line losses here in green, but there's a real different benefit you gain with storage air conditioning, and that is that you're making the ice in most cases at night, and the air is cooler, so the air conditioner runs more efficiently. And so you wind up with essentially 100% efficiency with air conditioning storage. Compressed air, pumped storage, hydro, and batteries all have round-trip efficiencies in the 70 to 80% range. So you're losing 2 or 3 kilowatt hours out of every 10 that you send to storage. There are 45 million electric water heaters in the United States and nearly the same number of electric air conditioners. These thermal storage techniques are huge opportunities, so I've spent more time on them than any of the others. The sixth strategy is retire older inflexible generating plant. Old steam plants have to run at some minimum load all night in order to be available to ramp up during the day. They are being replaced really quite quickly with natural gas flex units that ramp up more quickly. So, this era is going behind us, and the GE flex combined cycle unit that can ramp up from 0 to full output in about 15 minutes is becoming a tremendous opportunity. Because I've assumed that utilities have built this retirement into their forecasts, I didn't attribute any change in the load shape to this. However, I think that these retirements are happening faster than was anticipated. The 165 coal plants retired or announced for retirement just in the last 4 years. So I think we're gaining flexibility there a little faster than we had expected. The seventh strategy has to do with utility rates. That is concentrating utility prices into the ramping hours to get customers to consider investing in thermal storage, to consider investing in targeted energy efficiency, and to schedule their production to take advantage of lower cost pricing. A real typical commercial rate around the U.S. is a customer charge of $10 a month, a demand charge of $10 a kilowatt, and an energy charge of 10 cents a kilowatt hour. I did a modeling for one utility of a future rate that would keep the $10 a month customer charge, but would change the demand charge. So it's $2 a kW whenever your peak occurs, even if it's the middle of the night, but an additional $12 a kW for demand incurred during the ramping period, in their case of 4 to 7 p.m. And then a time of use rate that was cheap during the off-peak hours and very expensive during the on-peak hours. And with that type of a rate design, we estimated that we could have a significant decrease in the daytime load of the utility and a modest increase in the off-peak load of the utility. And, you know, as a simple example of how this would work, we talked with one industrial customer that was a one-shift metal fabricating company, and they said, oh yeah, we could work 6 to 3 instead of 8 to 5. If it would save us a couple $1,000 a week on electricity, you bet. We could have people come in earlier. Heck, they'd even beat traffic. So there's another energy conservation savings to be had as a spin-off from this type of pricing. The eighth strategy is to deploy electricity storage, but to do it strategically. Batteries are very expensive. They're getting cheaper, they're getting better, but they're very expensive, and as I showed, you lose about 2 kilowatt hours for every 10 you put in. But if we put it at strategic locations, places that we can also avoid transmission and distribution upgrade costs, if we can get control of electric vehicle batteries so that the grid operator and the electric vehicle owner can conspire, if you will, so that the electric vehicle owner says, charge me when it's cheap, but shut me down when it's expensive. Or push the panic button, say, I need power for now at any price so that I can drive home. Most of the time, people would push the economy button on their electric vehicle charger and let the grid operator be in control. So I've assumed storage equal to 1% of total load. That's pretty small. But certainly a big increase from where most utilities are today. And with that 1%, we can add load in the middle of the night. We can reduce load in the middle of the day, reduce load during the ramping hours, rather, possibly take advantage of some solar energy in the middle of the day if it's available, and smooth out our load shape a little bit. The ninth is one that people are, generally familiar with, demand response, contracting with customers for curtailment on an as-needed basis. Currently, the New England ISO has about 8% of its peak load under contract. I've assumed that 3% is a reasonable target. Why 3 and not 8? Well, because the time of use strategies and the thermal storage strategies, I think, will take up a lot of the potential that is currently reflected in demand response programs in New England. So I think it would be double counting if I used their 8%. And there's some experience of demand response being a resource that if you use it too often, the customers lose interest in participating. So I took a pretty conservative approach to demand response. But once again, we're taking a little bit of load off of the neck of the duck. The other thing with demand response, I did not assume that load would come back at any other hour. I assumed all of the load shifting that was possible was accounted for in the other strategies, the thermal storage strategies, the battery storage strategies, and the shifting under time of use pricing. So here I've just got a little bit of curtailment on the days when the grid operator really needs it. And the 10th strategy is one that is heavily in use in the West, less in use in the rest of the country, which is to take advantage of interregional power exchanges. For example, the Pacific Northwest is a morning peaking region and a winter peaking region, while California is an afternoon peaking region and summer peaking region. There's about 8,000 megawatts of transmission interconnection between the two. And those were originally built to move cheap surplus hydropower from the Northwest to California. But those lines are being used more and more in a bidirectional manner. And here I assumed that 3% of sales could be shifted around in time to smooth out the load curve for our sample utility. For the key hours, this is actually a pretty big impact. And this clearly is a region-specific strategy and may require transmission interconnections that don't exist. But I'll note that Minnesota Power has developed wind resources in North Dakota and connected to hydro resources in Manitoba, and in essence is now storing wind power in the hydro system of Manitoba. Whereas when the wind is blowing, they take power from North Dakota. When it's not blowing, they draw power from the hydro system in Manitoba to give them a smoother load shape to meet with their controllable resources. So this duck is now just about ready to spread its wings and fly. How did we do? Well, let's look at where we started with this kind of a load shape, and where we finished with a very different load shape to be served with the dispatchable resources. Tree strategy, we had a 73% load factor before solar and wind, that is in 2012. With solar and wind, we had a 63% load factor. With these strategies, we now have an 83% daily load factor. The hourly maximum rate is down to 300 maximum ramp. The hourly ramp is down to 340 megawatts versus 400 in the beginning and 550 by 2020 without the strategies. So by any measure, this utility has an easier load to follow than it did when we began. Now we can now kind of flip through the strategies one at a time, start with targeted energy efficiency, move on to some of the storage strategies, and then ultimately to the interregional exchanges. And it's really quite a dramatic change. Each of these strategies is small. I used what I think are conservative assumptions to illustrate each of the strategies. But this duck is requesting permission for takeoff. And with that, I'd be happy to stay on the phone as long as people have questions.
Hey, Jim, thanks very much. That was a great presentation, and unsurprisingly, it did lead to quite a few interesting questions here, and let me ask you some. A couple of people asked about one specific thing having to do with reorienting panels from the south to the west or southwest. If you do that, in addition to shifting the time of generation, aren't you also going to be producing fewer kilowatt hours than if the panels were oriented south.
Yes, you produce about 5% fewer kilowatt hours, and depending upon the region's time of use characteristics, in California, that output has a value that is about 15% greater.
Okay, great. And before I go to the next question, I'll tell people on the phone, you could continue to type in additional questions if you have them. Someone else writes in that she's heard that the duck shape doesn't show up every day, but may be more prevalent in the shoulder months. So her first question is that true? And do some of the seasonal changes help in trying to figure out how to design the strategies you're talking about, or which strategies might be more important in which region?
Yes, yes, and yes. The duck shape varies by region and by season. The biggest challenges so far in California have been in the shoulder seasons, but partly that's because those shoulder seasons have historically been the period when thermal generators have been taken out of service for annual maintenance. And so the systems have less flexibility during those shoulder seasons. That's kind of a self-imposed constraint. In Hawaii, the duck shape is where the seasons, they go pretty much from summer to summer to summer. The seasons are pretty consistent in Hawaii, and they're seeing the ramping challenges nearly every day. And in fact, the island of Molokai, one of the smallest, actually it's the second smallest of the systems in Hawaii, is already seeing its minimum load occurring at 2 in the afternoon because of the degree of solar penetration on the Molokai electric system that's operated by Maui Electric Company. And they're expecting that to be true in Oahu, Maui, and the Big Island within the next year, that their minimum loads will be in the middle of the day. So then they still have, very high usage in the evenings, although their water heating is a fabulous potential resource. Since there is no natural gas, everybody has pretty much either solar water heat or electric water heat. And in the apartment sector, which is about half to 60% of the housing stock, it's essentially all electric heat. So Hawaiian Electric is looking very aggressively at water heat control to help them smooth out their afternoon load shape. But from region to region, the shape will be different, and from season to season, the challenges will be different.
Well, here's a question. Many of the folks on this call are either representatives of state public utility commissions or state energy offices. How do you approach these issues from a state perspective if you're part of a regional electricity market like PJM, for example?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think that progressive rate design is pretty critical. And, PJM and all of the other regional electricity markets have wholesale costs that vary by season and time of day. And, so the rate design piece of this is very easy for the states to follow. I guess I'm going to back up here a little bit to the to the 10 strategies. Nearly all of these strategies are either under the influence, they're all under the influence of the utilities or the third-party administrators of public benefits programs, except for the interregional exchanges, which may require interstate cooperation. I think it's really a matter for each state to be looking at what are the economics of each strategy, but not to let any of the strategies be ignored in analysis. And I think that, frankly, we're not seeing thermal storage being evaluated. We're not seeing thermal plant retirement being evaluated, and we're seeing a pretty slow movement of concentrating rates, particularly commercial demand charges, into the ramping hours. In some regions, we've had wonderful demand response programs in place for a long time, for 30 years. Southern California Edison and some other utilities across the country have had air conditioning control programs. In other regions, it's not been touched. And those are all under local control. So really, only the 10th is a multi-state strategy.
Well, in your answer to that question, you did a good lead into my two next questions that came in, and one of them had to do with this issue that, if you look at your analysis, some of these strategies have a bigger impact than others. On top of that, some of the strategies are going to be less expensive than others. How much study has there been at all of the cost effectiveness of these various strategies? And if anything has been done, can you share any of that?
Lots has been done on almost all of these, and the quantity is pretty dramatic. Part of it is very dynamic. The cost of batteries is coming down as R&D in the battery storage field is changing. The two that I think are the most promising of these economically is managing electric water heat, which has a cost of maybe a penny a kilowatt hour to turn cheap power into valuable power, and air conditioning storage in large commercial buildings, which costs about 2 cents a kilowatt hour to turn power during cheap hours into the most valuable afternoon power that we've got. And there the research has been done by Steffes Electric. There's some going on at EPRI right now. There's a number of field trials of electric water heat going on around North America, from Hawaii to Newfoundland. And in air conditioning, CalMac is the largest, and their website is full of research and analysis on the cost of air conditioning storage. Strategy 6, the retiring older inflexible power plants, is something that should be looked at in the integrated resource planning process of utilities. We have a paper that we published on incorporating environmental costs into rates that encourages regulators to look at all of the potential future costs associated with keeping older power plants in service, including immediately pending environmental regulation, potential future and expected environmental regulation, for example, the ones through cooling regulations that are expected to be implemented soon, plus the prospect of future carbon regulation, and determining whether it makes sense to put another $1,000 into your 64-country Squire to keep it on the road a little longer. So that's one that has to be examined in the IRP process. As for rates, we have a publication on time varying and dynamic pricing that looks at the results that have been achieved around the country with time varying pricing and critical peak pricing, able to achieve up to a 35% reduction in peak demand. And I was just at a conference in California where the SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, announced their evaluation results of their residential critical peak pricing pilot program, which was a non-voluntary program, and they were achieving on the order of 30% peak load reductions, and they were targeting 3 hours with their critical peak pricing. Very similar to what you would do to tame the duck. So there's lots of good research out there, and we could spend all day. Well, we would drain my brain within a relatively short period, but if we opened up all the mics, we would be here all day to hear all of the wise people on this call sharing their experiences.
Well, thank you. That's a good start on that question. Following up on some of your comments about electric water heat, how sensitive is the advantage of thermal storage with water heaters to having the storage super insulated? Because obviously the current storage tanks are not all super insulated.
If you use an existing water tank, you really shouldn't go above 140 degrees, and so you limit the storage capacity of the water tank to about 15 kilowatt hours. And you will experience maybe 6 or 7% standby loss if you do that with existing tanks. The cheapest way to implement a water heat management program would be to have appliance standards that required the control technology to be installed at the factory, or an incentive program so that when the customer walks into Home Depot, the controlled water heater is $100 and the uncontrolled water heater is still $500, and the customer will choose the controlled water heater in most cases. And if you install it at the factory, it's only about $100 extra to install both the control systems and additional insulation. So it's a very cheap resource to do at the new water tank level. Since the average life of a water tank is only about 12 years, and we've got 45 million electric water heaters in the country, we would be deploying about 4 million a year. If just with an appliance standard alone, and within 12 years we'd have probably 80% of the water heaters replaced. Obviously, some last longer than the normal lifetime. So I think it's a lot cheaper resource if you do it at the manufacturing level, but some of the retrofits that have been implemented, they will retrofit the tank and add as much of a water heater blanket to the existing tank as they reasonably can within the space that's there. About half of these water heaters are in multifamily housing and are unlikely to ever migrate to heat pump water heaters or solar water heaters. The other half are in single family homes, and the appliance standards for large water heaters are all, I think it's 2016 or 2017, require heat pump water heaters for the larger tank sizes. And so when I actually look at evaluating the potential, I tend to focus on the multifamily sector. One nice thing about the multifamily sector is that you can, with one property manager, you can get access to 20 or 50 or 200 or 400 water heaters. And deploy a plumbing crew an electrical crew to methodically go through the complex and do the retrofits, either with add-on controls or with replacement tanks that already have controls built in. So I'm pretty fond of the multifamily sector as the target for managing electric water heat.
Good. And this follows up another point you were making related to this slide, which is related to strategy 10, using more interregional exchanges. What additional policies would be required to achieve that? Would FERC need to provide authority? Would DOE or some other agency need to provide transmission upgrade funding? Or is this something, you can envision the states working together to just do on their own?
Well, I've got a parochial view of this living on the West Coast, because our we added 8,000 megawatts of transmission between the Northwest and California in the 1960s, and we've been doing this for half a century now. And I don't really understand. I'm not an expert in market design or in transmission, so I know what can be done, but I'm not going to venture a guess on how to get from here to there in other parts of the country.
Okay. Here, a question about DSM financial incentives. Do you think states should structure DSM financial incentives so that they emphasize flattening the duck rather than energy conservation?
Yes, I think the program should be designed on the basis of economic efficiency, and if electricity is worth 20 cents in the afternoon and 10 cents in the middle of the day and a nickel at night, we should evaluate programs on that basis. But that valuation needs to include the avoided environmental costs, not just the avoided fuel and power plant costs. And in many regions, the marginal resource in the middle of the day is natural gas, and the marginal resource in the middle of the night is coal, and the environmental costs of those two forms of generation are quite different. And the evaluation needs to consider not just what goes into the utility dispatch model that's presented in a rate case, but also the societal benefits in terms of carbon emissions and health impacts, and that may significantly add value to nighttime efficiency. But maybe a good example of how that's done in an IRP process is the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which looks at all measures, generation and demand-side measures, in 4 daily time periods for each of 12 months. So the benefits and costs are binned into 48 bins. And the value of, when we first added the load shape to the value of energy efficiency in 2002 here in Washington State, where we have a winter peaking system, the value of weatherization, of residential weatherization, almost doubled by considering the load shape. And that enabled the utility to justify full funding of the low-income weatherization program, which enabled the weatherization agencies to dramatically ramp up the rate at which they were providing weatherization services to low-income families, the quality of life and health benefits that result from that kind of weatherization, which are non-energy benefits, are quite dramatic, but they were able to fully fund them with utility funding by considering the load shape. So I do think the load shape is very essential, and that if you consider all of the benefits of energy efficiency, chances are you're going to be, by doing this, increasing the on-peak savings, but probably maintaining or also increasing the cost-effective off-peak savings. We've got a paper that I worked on called The Full Valuation of Energy Efficiency Benefits, available on our website, that we call our layer cake paper, where we look at trying to identify all of the utility system benefits, all of the participant benefits, and all of the societal benefits, and recommend that all of them be considered. And I think when that's done, the cost effectiveness threshold the council came up with is in the Northwest is on the order of about 15 cents a kilowatt hour when all of the regional benefits were considered. So with that kind of a cost effectiveness threshold, the opportunities in energy efficiency are generally much higher than are currently being funded across the country.
Okay. We have 3 more questions, and they'll probably fill out the remainder of our time here. One is, have any states or utilities looked at variable incentives for things like net metering or other solar incentives that would encourage people to orient their solar panels in a suboptimal way, such as orienting them west to help shave peak load?
Well, after I gave this presentation at a meeting in Burbank, California, the next day the Solar Program Administrator, Burbank Water and Power, started the process of modifying their own incentive program. That's the only example I know of at this point. However, there are quite a few that have solar customers who are net metering on time of use rates. And if you're net metering on a time of use rate and the rate is higher in the afternoon than it is in the morning, you have a built-in economic incentive to orient to the west. And I've not seen any studies of how effective those have been or whether the solar industry even responds to that pricing incentive in speccing systems. I'm just not enough of an expert in solar installation to know what the effect of that has been.
Okay. Well, here's a question that I think you partially addressed, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to elaborate on it a little. And this person writes, there seems to be a lot of emphasis on energy storage strategies in your list here. Can you talk a little bit about the cost-benefit trade-offs of reliance on storage? It's generally acknowledged that the cost of energy storage is very high relative to its benefits due to high initial capital costs and due to inherent fuel cycle inefficiencies.
That's the reason I focused on thermal storage. Thermal storage is pretty cheap. Here it's way at the low end of battery, compressed air, pump storage, hydro costs in terms of either the cost per kilowatt or the cost per kilowatt hour. And in terms of thermodynamic efficiency, some of the studies on air conditioning storage by ICE Energy, which is a company that makes systems that are really designed for the kinds of air conditioners that get put on strip malls, are showing more than 100% efficiency. That is, the gain in efficiency from doing the heat rejection at night outweighs the energy loss from first turning air into ice and then turning ice back into chilled air. I put this at 100% efficiency, but the ICE Energy is claiming about 110% net efficiency. That is the heat rejection gains and the loss reductions. I mean, keep in mind that at peak hours, the marginal line, the average line losses on utility systems are about 9% around the country. But that's about 6% off-peak and 15% on-peak. And the marginal line losses are, that is, the ones that would be saved by reducing the peak load, are the marginal on-peak line losses are about 1.5 times the average on-peak line losses. So you can wind up with, avoiding 20% line losses by reducing a circuit loading during, afternoon hot summer peak hours. And if you can then fill that air conditioner with ice in the middle of the night when the grid is coasting, you might have losses of 5 or 6 or 7%, at the marginal losses of 5 or 6 or 7%, and you can wind up with about 15% avoidance of losses just by shifting from night to day. And if you count the avoided marginal line losses, and I encourage people to look at our paper on the value of valuing marginal line losses that's on our website, plus the phase change, the heat rejection advantages of storing ice at night, it's quite dramatic. With respect to the question of the high cost and low efficiency of battery and pump storage and compressed air storage, I agree, they're much more expensive. The one thing about batteries is that they can be temporarily located for a few years at one substation that's where there may be a need for augmenting capacity, and then once that capacity is either augmented by upgrading the substation or the transmission lines to it, or that load is abated by investing in energy efficiency, and load shifting at the customers, you can then put that battery bank back up onto wheels and haul it to another substation and deploy it somewhere else. So batteries are very expensive, but also very, very flexible. I don't want to discount the prospect of batteries becoming a great investment in the future.
Good. Well, we're going to go a couple more minutes because I did say there was another question I wanted to ask, and then I was going to ask you for any final wrap-up thoughts. The last question was, in the Pacific Northwest, there have been concerns specifically focused on how to mesh wind and solar with hydro. Of the 10 strategies you suggest, are there any that are specific to the Pacific Northwest that would work best there, or is it the same general array of strategies as other places?
The strategy that would work best in the Pacific Northwest is managing electric water heat. We have the highest saturation of electric water heat in the country as a result of our historically low electricity prices. There are a couple of states in Deep South that are equal to us in electric water heat, but the Northwest is over, the country as a whole is about 50% electric water heat, 50% gas. The Northwest is more like 60% electric water heat. If we gained control of the electric water heaters in the Northwest, basically one water heater under control is enough to provide the storage and shaping for 2 kilowatts of wind or solar energy out there. So if we've got 2 million water heaters in the Northwest, we could manage the storage and shaping for about 4,000 megawatts of wind and solar energy just by controlling the electric water heaters. And frankly, the west side of the Northwest, the I-5 corridor from Bellingham down to Eugene, has a lower air conditioning saturation than most of the rest of the country. And on the west side, air conditioning will be a less attractive strategy. On the east side, Spokane, Boise, Eastern Oregon, air conditioning is universal and substantial, and we look like the rest of the country there, so it's a great strategy there. But I would say water heat is the one that's, water heat and the interregional exchanges are the two, and the interregional exchanges have historically been economy energy. They need to be developed much more for day-to-day moving power back and forth to take advantage of the fact that the wind is blowing at different hours in the Northwest than it is in California, and that the loads are different at different hours. So I would say water heat and interregional exchanges are the two that are most attractive to the Northwest. We have the fewest coal plants, although as they are being retired, we're gaining flexibility, and there's a recent study that shows that shutting down the one nuclear plant would be economic, and it was based primarily on the inflexible nature of that plant's operations. About half of the power is being produced at low-value hours. So there's some that are pretty Northwest-centric.
Good. So is there anything else we should have asked you, or do you have any famous last words?
We've got a challenge. We can meet that challenge. We've adapted over 125 years to an awful lot of change in the electric utility industry. We're going to have to adapt faster than we ever have before because the world is changing faster than it ever has before. And if we don't move quickly on some of these cheap strategies, we're going to wind up back into one or more expensive strategies. And we don't need to do that. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Hey, Jim, thank you very much. That was a great presentation, and I think folks got a lot out of it. It will be posted on our website in the next couple of days, and folks could see it there and send it on to other people. So thanks very much for joining us. And folks on the call, look forward to announcements of future webinars from the Clean Energy States Alliance and the RPS Collaborative. Thank you all.